Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're located. My name is Karen Righthand. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Marketing here at SCS Global Services, and I'll be your host today. On behalf of everyone here at SCS, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar about developing corporate greenhouse gas inventories. Before I introduce our topic and the speakers for today's webinar, I'd like to take a moment to update you all on our webinar platform, GoToWebinar. To avoid any unnecessary background noise, all of you are you're in mute only, and so it will be a one-way presentation for the duration of the event. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. So you will see in your control panel a place to ask questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, please go to that section of your control panel and type your question as you're thinking about it and hit send, and it will be sent to the panel for review, and I'll be moderating the questions at the end of the webinar. Yeah, so be sure to ask them as you think about them. And depending on the amount of time allotted at the end, we will make every attempt to answer all the questions, but we can also follow up with you individually if we don't get to your question. I also want to let everyone know that our presentation is being recorded, and you will all receive an email with the link to the recording so that you can share it with colleagues or listen to it again. And with that, I'll get right into our presentation. I don't know how many of you are either customers or know about SCS, so I just wanted to say just a couple words about SCS Global Services. We are now in our 40th year of business, which is really exciting, and we are an international leader in third-party sustainability certification, consulting, auditing, and standards development. We have done tens of thousands of certifications in over 125 countries around the world. We've probably got over 15,000 clients, and we have auditors in every major market. Next. And our reach is really pretty much in every sector of the economy. We have certifications, probably over 120 certifications in all of these different sectors. We help companies stand out for their good environmental work by, helping them certify the claims that they want to make in the marketplace. Next. And we are located all over the world. So this is just a map of, where we have auditors and offices and certification services. So just wanted to set that as the benchmark for SCS. And with that, I'm going to introduce today's speakers, Prachiti Naranjan and Sebastian Kasparian, and they will proceed with the presentation. And like I said, if you have a question, please type it as you think of it, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Prachiti Naranjan. I'm the Technical Manager and SCS Services in the Climate Services Group. And let's start by talking about what is a corporate greenhouse gas inventory. So a greenhouse gas inventory, GHG inventory, is a list of emission sources and the associated emissions with all of those sources. And this is quantified using standardized methods. It's classified across 3 scopes. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard these terms before: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And going back to the standardized methods, GHG protocol is a globally recognized, and it's the most widely used standard by companies to calculate a GHG inventory. And GHG protocol has released several guidances, the GHG protocol being one, Scope 2 guidance, corporate value chain guidance, Scope 3 calculation guidance. So there's a lot of literature out there, and it can be overwhelming, but the more you familiarize yourself with these terms and guidances, the easier it gets. And finally, GHG inventories are done on an annual basis, so for a continuous 12-month period, and this can be done on a calendar year basis or fiscal year basis, that's really up to the company for you to decide. All right, so let's quickly touch on the benefits of developing a corporate GHG inventory. First, you can identify hotspots. So these are really those emission sources that could be responsible for 10%, 15%, or even more of the total emissions. And you can direct strategies at those hotspots, and that'll in turn save energy and save costs. You can also use your GHG inventory to report on corporate responsibility initiatives such as CDP or setting a science-based target, SBTI. GHG inventories can also be used to meet customer expectations, identify environmental risks throughout your supply chain, and they can also be used to meet reporting requirements from regulations. And a few that we want to call out here are the Senate Bill 253 signed by California governor and the SEC final rule. And so it was a proposed rule for the longest time, but as of last month, it is final. And so, and all of these things, you know, they have a phased in approach. So it's not like you're going to have to report your scope 1 and 2 emissions starting tomorrow, but it's better to stay ahead of this curve as it is going to come up in the next few years. And these final two, they really help you position yourself as a leader within your industry. We can anticipate going forward that resources are going to be limited, they're going to be constrained, and thus costs for certain materials or services might increase. And companies that are prioritizing this are getting recognized, and more than that, they're really making significant progress in reducing their emissions. And so the earlier you jump in and get started, the better. It's not too late. All right, so here we have the classic diagram from the Scope 3 standard. You really can't have a GHG inventory slide deck without this image. It clearly shows what all is included in Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And we are going to go into more detail into that later in the webinar, so I won't do that here. But I do want to call out the 7 gray circles at the top of the diagram. So you can hopefully see CO2, CH4, which stands for carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, I'm sure many of you know, going left to right. So these are the 7 groups of greenhouse gases established by the Kyoto Protocol that are assessed in a greenhouse gas inventory. And these are all then aggregated into a single metric known as CO2 equivalents. And that calculation takes into account each of the gases' respective heating potential. And so at the end of the day, when you get your final results, it's going to be in metric tons of CO2 equivalents. Okay, so some key questions to ask prior to initiation. If you're, what is driving your corporate GHG inventory? So we really need to think about, are you going to use your GHG inventory to report to CDP? Are you going to use it to set a science-based target? Or are you only using it for internal knowledge for your company? And the answer to that question is really going to determine the intensity of the GHG inventory and which Scope 3 categories you're going to include. Are you going to include many of them or just a select few since it's your first time? So it's important to know the answer to this question. Secondly, do you have dedicated personnel to lead and support this initiative? Needless to say, it's a large undertaking for an organization, so it's important to make sure that you have allocated enough resources for this exercise and that the whole organization is really on the same page and open to support throughout the process. All right, so this third question is probably the most important question. I like to think of it as the rate determining step for the greenhouse gas inventory. Do you have strong data collection systems in place? So again, it's the rate determining step. If you have lots of different places where the data is sitting, if it's not streamlined, if that data, once you do collect it and receive it, if it requires further processing, then that's all going to lead to time-intensive and resource-intensive efforts. And they're all indications that the data collection system can be a little stronger. And so obviously it's not meant to be perfect on day one or year one of doing your greenhouse gas inventory, but we always encourage clients to build up their data collection system because those efficiencies really go a long way going forward. So this next question is, should the GHG inventory be third-party verified? So SCS Global Services, like Karen mentioned, is an accredited third-party certifier and assurance provider. So we do believe that independent third-party verification adds that necessary extra level of confidence to any claim or assertion that a company wants to make. So having your GHG inventory third-party verified, it does give your organization that much more confidence in the emissions results. And again, this also feeds back into this first question, what is driving your corporate GHG inventory? Because some frameworks have third-party verification as a requirement, other frameworks don't. And so those two questions can sort of go hand in hand there. And then finally, when do you need your results by? We're all working towards deadlines. For small to medium companies, this process on average takes 3 months. For larger companies with 50 sites, 100 sites across the world, it could take 4 to 5 months or even longer. And so always start as early as you can. And again, do keep in mind that these times can go down for the second and third year because of those efficiencies that we talked about. Okay, so this final slide for me is talking about the phases of a greenhouse gas inventory high level. And so this first phase is really important. Both parties are involved, so we would also be involved in discussing with you some of these questions that we've listed. It really sets the stage for the GHG inventory to be calculated. So what are the boundaries? What is that continuous 12-month reporting period? And you can gauge how many of your facilities have access to primary data, gauge what is the status of your data collection systems, so on and so forth. So that next phase is we've initiated and you're aware of what all types of data that you have to collect, and you begin the data collection process. And so this is primarily led by the company. SCS does offer check-in meetings for guidance and support to know if you're on the right track. And also once you collect all of that data and send it to us, we can do a gap assessment to make sure that everything is in place and do those quality checks. And then that third phase, once the data is collected, it's all good to go. SCS, that being our primary service that we provide, our team provides, will lead the emissions calculations. And that'll lead us right into the final deliverables stage, where we'll deliver a complete methodology report with the results, the hotspot analysis, and you as the client, you do have an opportunity to provide feedback prior to finalizing if you would like to see any additional analysis or context there. All right, and so with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Sebastian.
Thank you, Brigitte. So my name is Sebastian Kasparian. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on those Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So Scope 1 emissions are, again, those direct on-site emissions associated with owned or controlled sources. So common sources of those emissions are going to be fuels consumed from owned or operated facilities and or fleet vehicles. These are often broken out into stationary and mobile sources. So stationary would be things like generators, mobile is a bit obvious, things like vehicles. We're also looking at natural gas from heaters or boilers, refrigerants recharged during the reporting period. If we don't have recharge information, we can also do things like leakage rates to estimate emissions. And then as a final note here, depending on your industry, there may be additional specific sources relevant to you in Scope 1. This is really, tends to be with agriculture in particular, so looking at things like fertilizer inputs on a farm. But generally speaking, Scope 1 emissions are fairly straightforward. And now for Scope 2. So Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions associated with the generation of electricity, steam, heating and cooling, district heating, things of that nature. When we do Scope 2 calculations, we always look at location and market-based emissions. So for location, we'll be looking at the physical location of the facilities, combining that with grid-level data to estimate emissions. And then for market-based emissions, this is where we'll be looking at things like supplier-specific factors or contractual instruments such as renewable energy certificates, including things like IRECs and GOs. And so that's where we can take those into account. But in general, Scope 2 is going to look like your purchased electricity emissions broken out in that location and market-based estimate. And then lastly, we have Scope 3 emissions, which are the most complicated of the three and include all other indirect emissions across the value chain. So Scope 3 emissions are important to include in a GHG inventory because they often make up more than 70% of the inventory, all said and done. And what's more is this tends to be resulting from one or two key categories. It's categories like purchase goods and services or business travel can really make up the majority of your emissions as a corporate entity. And so when we look at these Scope 3 emissions, we always have screening as the first step. So if you remember that graphic that Prachiti showed before, we have 15 different Scope 3 categories split between upstream and downstream components. And when we do this screening process, we'll likely find that many of those do not apply to your organization. For example, while everyone will have purchase goods and services or business travel relevant to their inventory, only certain industries like manufacturing will have things like processing, use, end-of-life treatment of sold products. So that screening part is a very important part of the step. And then when we get into the data collection side, Scope 3 emissions can really create a significant burden in terms of data collection and inventory. So it's important to know that there are multiple ways that we can calculate emissions for any given category. For example, the GHG protocol allows us to use multiple methods for calculating categories such as business travel, for example, where we can use spend amounts on air travel or car rentals, or we could use actual distance information. Now, there is a hierarchy there in terms of data quality. So the spend information may be much easier to obtain, but it's often less accurate and may give a more conservative high estimate. So there are always going to be trade-offs when we enter that data collection step. And then here we have a slide on why SCS. So at SCS, we have more than 30 years of experience assessing carbon footprints for clients in major industries. And that service is not limited to just carbon footprinting. We also help with decarbonization strategy. We're helping you do that external reporting or disclosure. And in that way, SCS can really act as a one-stop shop because we can help you from the beginning of the data collection process all the way through that reporting step. Additionally, we can help you with a customized GHG inventory calculation tool. So after that first year, we can give you the power to estimate your emissions for subsequent years without needing to go through that intensive data collection calculation process that we went through the first time. And then in general, I'd just like to add a note here that greenhouse gas inventories tend to be an iterative process, and there's going to be a lot of back and forth in terms of what questions there are in data collection, what kinds of assumptions are involved. And so we really try to have a positive sort of partnership view with our clients. We're really working together to get this inventory created. No one of us can do it alone. And then in that same vein, we really try to emphasize customer service here at SCS. We have a dedicated team of professionals beyond Dave, Prachiti, and I that work on these sort of projects. We really emphasize communication and trying to scale up those efforts. going from year over year even. And then, as I mentioned before, inventories aren't the only thing that we offer at SCS. We can bundle services and often do. So for example, we can help you through that GHG inventory process and carry that over to a carbon neutral certification. And as a final note on this slide, SCS does have a strong reputation in this industry. We really do emphasize quality, robustness, and accuracy in our work. And I think our clients would say the same. And here's where we'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sebastian and Prachiti. We do have some questions coming in. So if, if anyone has a question that they would like answered, please feel free to put it in the question doc. So I would say, here's one, Sebastian, that you just sort of, both of you sort of hit on it, so I don't know which one of you wants to take it, but how often would you say your clients have to restate as new information comes to life, they realize they didn't capture a piece, et cetera?
Sebastian, I can take that first one.
Oh, sure, sure.
So I think, you know, that's really why that scoping phase is so important, is to make sure, and again, what is driving the inventory. And so as long as we have clear answers to those questions, then that first time around can be well informed, and we can sort of set the boundaries and set the scope of the project appropriately. Now, that being said, sometimes sort of plans change, priorities change for an organization, and so if they're wanting to be more ambitious with their greenhouse gas inventory, I think, you know, but I think majority of the times we really like to emphasize that scoping phase, and so there's no need to have that back and forth over and over again. I will say that base year recalculations sometimes do have to be done in the event of if you've acquired a company or you've divested from a company, then you do have to go back and sort of adjust all the way back to your base year. But that's a slightly different conversation, and I don't know if that's what they were talking about. So,
right. I mean, every year you have to compile, but once you have it, I would say from my experiences that once you've compiled the initial and you've got all the buckets sort of built out, then it's, you know, every year you're collecting data into those buckets. And but yes, if you're a large, I mean, at SCS, we as Prachiti mentioned, we do verify inventories for companies. Now, I will say that on the SCS Global Services side, we would not develop your inventory and also be your verifier. Obviously, we can't check our own work. That's a very important rule of the road. But we do have a lot of verification clients as well. And sometimes some of those big multinationals, they'll acquire a whole business unit from another company. And then that requires what, you know, kind of some recalculation like Prachiti was saying. There's another question that I think I could actually take, which is where is this regulation coming from, and is it required for all businesses? So Prachiti highlighted two regulations. One is the SEC ruling. The SEC ruling is currently on pause, but I would tell every company that if they are a public company, this is going to affect them, and you know, you probably, if you don't have your corporate greenhouse gas inventory, you should move on that and not just be waiting for the rule to be finalized. It was finalized. It's got some legal challenges, but I believe that it will become necessary to know your greenhouse gas inventory. So that's on the SEC side, it's for public companies. For the California bill, we just did a webinar on this a couple weeks ago, so I would point you to the webinar library on our website in resources. And I don't have the slide in front of me, but basically it covers both public and private companies depending on your revenue size. So if you are selling products into the state of California, it doesn't matter if you're only selling, you know, $1,000 worth of products into California or, you know, 10,000. It's more about the size of your company. So I would urge you, anyone that thinks they may fall into that category, if you're selling products in California, I would go back to that webinar that we gave 2 weeks ago and check that out, because the actual numbers of, you know, stuff and when you have to, when you're required to do assurance and all of that, it's in that webinar. And then another question is about handling process emissions for manufacturing companies. Who would like to take that one?
I can take that question.
Great.
What is in particular?
How do you recommend handling process emissions for manufacturing companies?
Well, I suppose that's a fairly high level question, but you know, when we're looking at process emissions, we're really looking at you know, understanding your product as a first step. You know, it sort of leads back to that sort of scoping question Puchiti said, or you know, discussed. You know, we'll try to ask the right probing questions in that step of the process. And when it comes to actually doing, you know, the calculations for the processing of salt product side, it really does get very specific into what kinds of, you know, what kinds of processes are necessary for your product to go onto that sold step. You know, looking at what the scope 1 and 2 emissions might look like from the processing entity for that kind of work. So it's a difficult question to sort of answer because it can get very specific.
Right. How would you even know, if you're a new company, how would you even know if you have process emissions?
Processing of sold products, well, it would really be if you're selling an intermediate product and it requires additional processing before it can be put on the shelf, essentially.
Uh-huh. Great. So how would, maybe Puchiti, you might want to take this one. How should an organization establish what it would measure as its baseline year?
Well, that's a nice question. So I think, you know, a couple of years ago with the pandemic, it was not business as usual for many companies. And so it's always best to choose a base year that is representative for your organization, and that didn't have any sort of special events that came up that made the operations go up or go down in any way. And so picking a recent and representative year is probably the best way to go.
Right, right. Sebastian, is there a minimum number of scope 3 categories that one would look at?
No, there's not really a minimum.
Right.
You know, we quite often work with clients who, you know, given what their data collection systems look like, for example, may decide not to include a category in their first year and just say, all right, next time round, we're going to make sure we capture those transportation emissions, things like that. So there's no minimum that you should really aim for, but in order to have a comprehensive footprint, we really should be looking at emissions for every relevant category. And so, you know, not to say this for the millionth time, but back in that scoping conversation is, as Puchiti said, is basically the most important step.
Right.
No, and I will add to that, like, again, like, are you going to use your inventory to set a science-based target? Because if so, you need to cover 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions in your target. And so to cover it in the target, you need to measure them in the first place, and so, or calculate them in the first place. And so again, you need to sort of keep all of these different pieces in mind. But if it's the first time you're doing this exercise and it's primarily for your internal knowledge and benefit, then there's no minimum per se.
Great, great. Well, we're about a minute over time, so I think we'll leave it there. We will be following up with an email that will have the recording. And we look forward to working with you in the future. If this is a service that you need, you can reach out to Oren, who's pictured on the slide here. And we will be happy to answer additional questions offline. Thank you so much for your participation today. We hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.